Confessions of a Crashed Charismatic, written and read by Thomas Kay. It can be so desperately painful, the devastating power of love. How deeply you can fall when a conspiracy of circumstances over the years has dictated a solitary path to your life. And certainly, isolation can be a breeding ground for the illicit and immoral. But it can also spawn a commitment towards moral perfection when a sudden conversion to evangelical Christianity fires the regenerated mind and heart towards faith, service, and obedience to Christ. And the more one seeks righteousness, the more one realizes the corruption of the soul, and yet one cannot fully renounce sin. Ill-fitting seems this mantle of faith to a body that can't keep God's law. He who'd be righteous will find himself split, his purpose and nature at war. Carrying one's cross can add pressures to a young life that an unbeliever cannot know, and it cuts you off from well-meaning mentors who, not being Christians, you feel cannot be trusted to advise or help. I look back at my life as a teenager and young adult and see that persecution at home diverted me into prayer, speaking the gospel, and introspection. In these years I should have given my mind over to study, and indeed I did work hard and took my studies seriously, but as I say, I was diverted. My quarrel has never been with Christ, but with his church and with my father, for both put unbearable loads on my back. The consequences and pain of those days will remain with me for the rest of my life. You see, at the age of 19 I did fall in love, willingly, wholeheartedly, and with an initial feast of honeyed infatuation and joy. There were many factors that brought about my later desecration, and this is how it unfolded. It was on a Tuesday morning towards the end of September 1974 that I registered as a student at the University of Aston in Birmingham. It was one of those chilly, early autumn days when the sun shone over a cloudless, deep blue sky, when the trees had just begun to turn, and an early frost had made the grass hard and white. I was to undertake a combined honours degree course in biology and chemistry in this my home city. 3 years of lectures, practicals and tutorials. And here I was at the back of a 200-yard queue, thoroughly depressed at the prospect of it all, waiting to show my A-level certificates. After a 55-minute wait, I was eventually registered and passed through double doors from the Great Hall into a corridor where the Christian Union had a stall. I made my acquaintance there with a representative called Mark, who was trying to identify the Christians among the freshers. We have a Bible study every Wednesday afternoon. Please join us. We meet in the Students' Union at 2 p.m, but sometimes we have lunch together first. I might join you, I said. I was saved last April. I was converted in a pub through the outreach of the local Bible college. Looking back now, I feel that I should never have embarked on this course of study. I might certainly have had an easier ride and missed the drama and sufferings of these coming months and years had I worked in a bank or estate agents or chosen one of many other paths. But I had no choice in the matter. It was decided for me by my father. During my school days, from the age of 7, I had been pressured by him to study. The seeds of my downfall were sown at that time. I had been educated at a private preparatory school in Edgbaston and tutored as well, that I might pass the 11+ examination and get into one of the grammar schools in the city. There was no doubting my parents' commitment to my education. I duly passed and got a place in a school 10 miles away. This was reached by riding on 2 buses there and back, and meant an hour's travelling each way. I would leave the house at 7:40 a.m. for this tortuous journey, and by mid-morning was often tired, hungry and flagging. Was it any wonder that I underperformed? Then I had homework every night during the week, with my workload spreading to Saturday mornings as well. In the upper years, I was expected to spend 3 hours each evening in study. But not being of an academic disposition, I spent many of these solitary hours in daydreaming, fantasies, and in boredom. All of my school friends lived on the other side of the city, and most evenings were spent in my room alone. My parents certainly provided a safe and stable upbringing for me, but looking back, I feel their obsessive demand for me to study was to the detriment of my health and future success in life. As I grew during my teenage years, I was more than once the victim of my father's anger, and once when I had concealed poor end-of-term examination results from him, he had found out and raised the roof. But I had only kept the secret because I knew he would make a meal out of criticism. I was under a cloud of depression for days after this, and made one of many attempts to try harder at school. But I gradually slipped down the class, underperforming in my O-level year. I wasn't all unhappy, though. My parents owned a small cottage on the Clee Hills near Ludlow in Shropshire, and I have many happy memories of staying there, with and without my parents, and this place formed a halcyon refuge in troubled times. I had a friend at grammar school, and from the age of 14 we spent holidays cycling, backpacking and camping in this area and further afield. At the age of 16 I learnt to fly gliders and managed 3 solo flights around an airfield in South Wales. And while at school still I first heard the Christian gospel explained by the vicar of a local Anglican church. This man spoke on the wide and narrow paths. I felt a flame burn deep within me as I heard these words expounded. Then the bell rang for afternoon lessons and I couldn't find out any more. Years later, I read Luke's Gospel, chapter 24, verse 32, the evening of the day of Jesus' resurrection. They said to each other, "Did not our hearts burn within us while he talked to us on the road, while he opened to us the Scriptures?" And I believed. My A-level passes on the whole were not exceptional. My father decided I must repeat the year and go to a sixth form college to do this. This is where I should have taken control of my own destiny and maybe left home. But when you're 18 and still unhatched, you accept parental authority. I studied the sciences because it was my father's ambition that I should follow in his footsteps and become a doctor. I hated studying, and now at college missed even the limited social contact I'd had at school. I was old enough now to drink in public houses, and usually spent Saturday and Sunday evenings drowning my sorrows in a pub in Selly Oak. I had another friend of those days who bought me drinks, and I still remember chips and curry sauce each weekend while listening to Simon and Garfunkel's Bridge Over Troubled Water in this friend's bedroom. It was in April 1974 that I met some Christians from the local Bible college in the Bournebrook Hotel and responded to their message. I had spent the year realising that the childhood religion I'd always followed, Catholicism, had no power to help me. I knew I was in darkness, and intuitively I was reaching out for some spiritual reality. I had read many works of literature over the months, including Hermann Hesse's The Prodigy, and I had absorbed the darkness of Elton John's early albums. My despair had reached a climax the previous month when I swallowed 20 aspirins, only to regurgitate them within minutes. But now I'd met these Christians who would show me, I hoped, the love of and the way to God. I was converted in April 1974. When I started at Aston University, it was through the clearing system that I'd been offered a place. This matched prospective students with available courses. My father had had me running around the dental school and the law faculty at the Polytechnic, and was disappointed now that my A-level passes would only get me onto a Bachelor of Science degree course. I bowed to parental pressure, bought the scarf, and turned up for the orientation meeting at the start of term. Early days I was stretched by the academic work, trying to face up to my new Christian life, and very depressed at home. I was saddened by the apparent shallowness of most of the Christians, yet intimidated by many of the girls who seemed so authoritative and self-assured, and I sensed a spiritual warfare going on around me. I did my duty as regards studying, but also played the organ at church early on a Sunday morning, and attempted to share my faith with those around me. I got more and more tired as term went on, and didn't take enough rest. In late November I tried to share my faith with my father. I wanted to express the peace of knowing a personal Saviour, the security of sins forgiven, the new wine found in spiritual worship, and the love of Jesus, who surrendered all to his Father, even to dying on a cross. But he responded with fury, said he had always hated evangelical Christians since his own university days. He was afraid of poverty, he said, and I must forget this religion and concentrate on my studies, or I would be ruined. I wept for him that night, saw him as lost, and started praying on a regular basis for his salvation. I got a holiday job at the end of term sorting mail for the post office. Even during the Christmas holidays he expected me to study. The bad atmosphere at home dampened my spirits, and I returned to college unrefreshed. I had become trapped in a guilt state over studying, and now felt culpable whenever I relaxed or went out. The acuity of my mind was not as strong now, and my memory was not so good. Going to church in those years I lived at home should simply have been a solace. Indeed, I went to an Elim Pentecostal church with a congregation of about 400, and the worship was spirit-anointed at times. The repeating of gospel choruses, sung lustily by the congregation, was interspersed with solo singers and hymns. But on 2 occasions now I had been called to the platform by the pastor without warning and asked to speak about my faith. I felt so inadequate there, answering his questions, because I was not used to public speaking. And his sermons were aggressively preached, with an air of anger in them, as if he were venting his own frustrations on his congregation. And there was a continual call to separate oneself from the world, to be single-track in one's commitment, to boldly witness to those not yet saved, and to climb a spiritual mountain of worship. Such was the pressure from the platform that at times I felt confused, condemned, and came away troubled. And yet for 4 years I attended that church and convinced myself I was having a good time. I tried to love the vicious God of this preacher, and was unwittingly fired by a fear of eternal damnation, because surely this man beat us over the head with the gospel. And so, as winter turned to spring 1975, I was becoming sidetracked into thinking I had to save the world. Instead of studying, I was compulsively meditating on what I should say to other students, to tell them about the love of Jesus. I tried to carry this load as well as my studies, and at home my father continued to abuse me. In April I fell in love with a girl called Annie Lee. She was a member of my own Bible study group, which we had both attended since the previous October. She was a shy girl, and had been taken aback when I mentioned a visiting speaker was coming this week to lead the study. It was as though she thought I wanted her to lead us. She blushed and withdrew from me, and I tried to reassure her. It struck me then that here was one of these girls I'd been so scared of, with feet of clay. Exams were looming, and I was working out a plan of study whilst travelling home on a number 50 bus. As I juggled my thoughts about, I realised that if I worked hard, I could yet pass my exams. Then it hit me, with a wave of joy, a honeyed infatuation. I love her, Annie. I was well and truly caught up in this ecstasy, and suddenly wanted to see her, and if possible to date her. I nearly missed my bus stop. I waylaid Annie after the next Christian Union meeting, and declared my love to her, saying, "Is there any chance you'd go out with me? It's just that you're lovely." At this she blushed, her eyelids fluttered and her lower lip dropped. She said she would see me soon. I waited 10 lonely days until I saw her again. She missed the next Christian Union meeting. Then one afternoon I met her in the street. She told me then there was no hope for us as a couple. She was committed to her boyfriend Paul and would stay with him. I begged her to reconsider and went home, extinguished in spirit. The power of this love continued in her absence to grow in the following months, and I turned to Jesus as my advocate in this. Yet I felt chastised by the crushing of my spirit that followed. I was desperately in love and unable to communicate my state to Annie. I felt rejected and broken. At this point I sought ministry from the pastor, but he told me to carry my own load and try to cast demons out of me. He also told me that my love for Annie was sinful. It was a wrong relationship, he said. The experience left me more estranged than ever. In late April I began to crack. My natural insight and interpretation of those things around me were affected detrimentally by the pressure I was under. My father laid on more pressure, and I found my work output declining. I loved the spring that year, and remember the lengthening evenings, light up the fire, the parchment album, and the chill of dawn most days. I visited Cliff College in Derbyshire with a friend to hear the evangelist David Watson speak, and with this man's teaching, this bright sunny day, came the ghost of a desire to enter the church myself as a minister. There was a Christian Union house party held at a country house in Worcestershire one weekend in late April. This occurred shortly after Annie's rejection of my advances. It was, for me, a weekend of acute suffering, as Annie was quite cold towards me now. There was, of course, no alcohol there. It might have helped had I been able to get drunk, but in those days I didn't drink. All I remember now is a ride on a horse and a glass of lemonade in the cellar of this house with Annie on the Saturday night, and I slept badly that weekend. Tiredness was a continuing problem. I always felt I had to be doing something and forced myself all the harder to do the Lord's work and also to study. Early June I was aware that my mind was racing at night, and often I awoke unrefreshed. There was also one weekend when a group of us gathered at my parents' cottage. I was sick with love for Annie, and she had joined us. I was forced by peer pressure to join in some idiotic dance on the lawn in full view of the neighbours, and even now I feel the pain of this. I wept for 2 dark hours solidly when I got home over Annie. Early June I grew the beginnings of a beard, swearing that I'd not shave it off until I saw her again. Then one morning, exams on the way, I experienced a strange buzzing in my head. It was like a clockwork motor, overwound, releasing its spring in one instant. Now Annie was about to spend the 3rd year of her sandwich degree course in Cardiff. She came from the Rhondda Valley in South Wales, and she and I had no plans to meet up. June the 24th I had passed my exams and was off to London to get a visa to visit the USA. I was to spend 2 months working in a children's camp in Pennsylvania. 3 days later I flew from Gatwick, a 7-hour flight, to John F. Kennedy Airport, New York. I checked in at the Commodore Hotel on 5th Avenue, 42nd Street, Manhattan, on the 28th of June. I now had several days to look around the city before taking a Greyhound bus to camp. I was to be a counsellor in a camp for minimal brain-damaged children from the city. The summer passed happily enough, but was very tiring. I got a good reputation as child worker and an excellent report at the end of the season. I remember, though, being unable to look people in the eye for long and constantly unable to hold my mind on any conversation. It kept racing ahead of me. I looked after 6, 8 to 10-year-olds who needed dressing, washing, feeding, changing and taking about to various activities. By the end of August I was exhausted. I now had a month to travel alone and visited Boston, Montreal, Toronto, Niagara, Chicago, Detroit Minneapolis, St. Paul, Billings, Seattle and San Francisco, all on a Greyhound bus. I spent the last week upstate New York in a town called Syracuse, staying with a girl I'd met at camp. She put me under pressure to have sex, but I resisted. It had been commonplace at camp among the counsellors. I flew home, weakened in my Christian commitment, run down and overtired. It was as though I'd had no holiday. But I'd crossed the Golden Gate Bridge and been out of the country for 3 months. My second year at Aston wasn't any happier. America had been good but not restful, and further sufferings followed. Now academically I hadn't the same commitment to my course and found it difficult to settle down to work. During the second week of term I met a girl called Jeanette at a prayer meeting. She became a support and friend, and though I felt nothing for her, emotionally or physically, we grew together as Christians and young adults. We composed a Christmas carol together and sang it at church with some other students. But I was bored in my studies, pressured at home, and lukewarm in my Christian commitment. When term ended, I met a female acquaintance on New Street Station. We went back to her lodgings and talked well into the night. A sudden kiss and embrace led to a physical relationship that went on behind Jeanette's back for 3 months. In a way, this relationship was a comfort, but the feeling of guilt was oppressive. I couldn't get free. The girl got hurt, and I had trifled with her feelings. I felt nothing for her at that time, but in later months and years was extremely sorry for her. I hated myself and turned back to God. I had left her weeping on the university library steps. I had told her to grow up. I'd been dragged down by the tide in the States. I felt forgiven, at least by God, and kept seeing Jeanette. Spring 1976 I was seeking the Lord, maybe as a rebound from this affair. But I knew a new release in the Spirit, suffered with joy, ran with God, committed myself more and more fully, and sang a new song, one of fragrance, as I felt God wrought a work of love in my life. My mind was damaged, though, and Jeanette told me that people were saying I was in need of psychiatry. But I took the words of the hymn of John Bunyan, "He who would valiant be 'gainst all disaster, let him in constancy follow the Master." So I carried on separate. I began to spend an hour alone each day in worship and prayer. We had had an evangelist speak at the Christian Union who had recommended this as a means of developing a close relationship with Jesus. I sought Father, Son and Holy Ghost. I began to have a heart experience of this triune, thrice holy God. I now spent a day in fasting and prayer, as this evangelist suggested. He said the sacrifice offered up in this way would advance one's Christian life by as much as by a year of discipleship. After this, it was as if God spoke to me on a bus. He knew where I was and that I'd begun to mean business with him. I was a loner in the months that followed, isolated even from Jeanette, although she continued to support me. On Good Friday I went to St. Chad's Roman Catholic Cathedral in the city centre with my mother. As we sang the last verse of "O Sacred Head Illusid," I seemed to see the head of Jesus fall to one side as he died on the cross, and I felt that I had died to sin. The Apostle Paul wrote, "I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me." Galatians chapter 2, verse 20. I felt I knew the Lord, and now being more authoritative in my witness in the university, I seemed to command a new respect from those around me. Jeanette told me she thought I should enter the ministry, and I considered applying for the Elim pastorate. I felt that God was with me. My Easter project was some research on the parasites of the long-tailed field mouse or wood mouse. It involved 3 weeks intensive fieldwork in the countryside near my parents' cottage and some laboratory work as well. I also composed a piano piece which I performed in the Centre for the Arts and sang the bass solo Polypheme in Handel's Acis and Galatea in front of 100 people. But I couldn't study effectively and felt unable to cope in many situations. It was in those days I met an elderly neighbour in the street and carried her shopping bags home for her. I listened to her, outpouring her life history to me, and sensed her frustration and her solitude. I sat with her frequently in the coming months in the ground floor flat she rented, and spent many hours trying to share the gospel with her. And at that time her company was kinder to me than that which I experienced at home. This lady died in that August, and I did not know whether she was saved or not. I could only commend her, in my prayers, into the care of God. Now my heart had started to smoulder with the fiery love of God, although I felt powerless to communicate this. I was trying to kindle a flame in my worship and becoming more and more burdened for the lost. All through these 2 years so far spent at Aston, I had been befriended by a student on my course. His interest was wargaming. Twice I stayed at his parents' home near Warrington and enjoyed these breaks. But at times I suffered his monopoly of the conversation about his battle strategy. Overburdened with mental stimuli, I tried to listen and agree with what he said, and I felt that he used this as a fence against the challenge of the Christian message that I tried to share with him. It seemed that whenever God used me that year, there was an accompanying reaction from my parents. That I was involved in a spiritual battle was impressed upon me by the consequent anger of my father, who was always at his most vitriolic when I had been speaking about Jesus. And I read these words of St. Paul. For we contend not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places, against the world rulers of this present darkness. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12. My father objected to my going to Christian Union meetings, and attacked me, I felt, with an almost satanic fury. My parents' personalities seemed stronger than mine, and the effect of their continued discipline seemed to undermine my peace and underline my guilt about studying. Now, with the mantra of repeating gospel choruses time and time again, although I kindled the spirit within me in times of solitary worship, I became aware of inappropriate thoughts appearing in my mind, and the sharpening of my mind to a point. Through this sharpening of my thoughts, by the various honing and shearing pressures I was under, I was becoming more and more single-track in my desire to serve God, and, I thought, distilling dewdrop gems of truth in my witness. I loved my father sorely during these desperate days. He himself was a solitary, and I wondered what scars, fears, sins and rejections had locked him up in the aggressive isolation that controlled his broken life. Anyway, summer came at last, and a group of us headed for Cornwall on a month's walk along the coast path. We took the train from Birmingham New Street to St Austell and joined the path at Charlestown. There followed a month of idyllic walking, with daily swimming during the extended drought of that year. The weather was exceptionally dry, sunny and warm, and the beauty of all this undeveloped coastline, seen in perfectly clement weather, was a once-in-a-lifetime experience. But I was to phone my parents to get my exam results after the first week. I phoned from Falmouth and was ordered home. How my spirit chilled when I spoke to them. You must come home. I had failed both exams, so it was I travelled to Birmingham alone and saw the head of the department. It was agreed I should repeat the year. My father stipulated a condition: no Christian Union meetings. I refused to submit, and we had a bitter row. In bad feeling, I went back to Cornwall, thinking I couldn't stand another year of the same pressure. The rest of that summer I spent at home. My parents were away on holiday in Austria, and I was left with much time to seek the Lord and to drink of his Spirit through listening to Jamie Owen's album Growing Pains. I drank of the Lord's love and let him minister to me through music and worship. I wanted always to be aware of him and to be opening my heart to him, be that on the piano or face down, singing or still before him. But I was aware of anger in my psyche, directed inwards towards myself, and imagined that maybe the Lord was angry with me, and I identified myself with the lamentations of Jeremiah. I am the man who has seen affliction under the rod of his wrath. Surely against me he turns his hand again and again the whole day long. Chapter 3, verses 1-3. My parents returned home in early September, and even as they returned I felt oppressed. Gone was the oil of blessing I had known, and turmoil and frustration followed. I looked forward to the days of seeing Annie again, and spent some time in the local library, reading about the geography, topography, culture and religious history of the mining valleys of South Wales. I also read Rape of the Fair Country, a tale of the ironworks of Dowlas in Monmouthshire in the early 19th century by Alexander Cordell. This was very evocative, but not inspirational. Anyway, September the 24th came, and with it Freshers' Week. I was so broken down now that I had to back out of certain CU commitments. I went to the cinema that night and watched All the President's Men, a reconstruction of the Watergate scandal in which various senators and journalists struggled to expose a cover-up by Richard Nixon, and in a parallel way I felt called to get the truth of Jesus out. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. John's Gospel, chapter 1, verse 5. Term began and I was up on my feet. I finished with Jeanette that first day. Annie had returned for her final year. I first saw her in the foyer of the Students' Union building, and my heart skipped a beat. She looked a little tired, I thought, but also lovelier than ever, and I asked her to meet me that same evening. We met in one of the music rooms in the same building at 5 p.m. I played us some Elton John songs and some Christian choruses that I'd perfected musically in America. I so loved her. I wanted her consent to go out with her, but I felt a cloud in my spirit that seemed to deny God's blessing on my love for her. There followed days of hopeless infatuation when I began to lose hold of reality. I began to feel that in moments filled with God's Spirit, sensual and tasting of his love, I could transmit these feelings into the minds of those around me, or that they were somehow floating in the air to be received by all present. Then I applied a message given by an evangelist at the Christian Union that week. Repentance is minutely, hourly, daily. I must return periodically to the cross for forgiveness in order to maintain an unbroken fellowship with the Saviour. I felt that God spoke through me to lecturers, using me as the inert vessel for communicating the power of his Spirit. And so psychosis set in. It was as if God was saying to me, "I've been waiting for you to be silent and still and to let me speak." Then I began to listen to my own mind that threw up in turn many deceitful and illusory impressions. I was sitting in the Students' Union bar, eating a sausage roll one lunchtime and meditating on the Scriptures, and it seemed to me that I had stepped into a new reality and that Jesus was speaking to me. He was saying that not only did he want to abide with me, but he wanted to actually walk in my body, in the world in 1976. I suddenly appreciated this truth and understood the impact of this message. Jesus himself would control the vessel of my body as I subdued all thoughts and desires to his will. I, in my damaged condition, realized I must put on Jesus Christ, who would carry me through various difficult situations when I would speak the words of God. Later that day I was approached by a member of the Unification Church, a Mooney, who wanted me to fill in a questionnaire. He asked me my name, and I felt prompted to answer, "I am who I am." I meant in all humility that Jesus was speaking through me. I was just the vessel that housed his Spirit, and I remembered a Bible verse. In a great house there are not only vessels for great and noble deeds, but also for menial tasks. If anyone purifies himself, he will be a vessel of honour, suitable for great deeds, and of great use to the master of the house. Second letter to Timothy, chapter 2, verses 20-21. One Saturday I went to see Annie in the tower block in which she lived. I was desperately in love with her, and I met her on the landing outside her flat. Paul was there with her. She was none too friendly and left me on the landing. I went home, jealous and on fire with desire and love. I witnessed to some people in the street in the heat of this conflagration and felt something in parallel of the hurt of Jesus when people reject him. At home I decided to fast and pray. For 17 hours I sought the face of God with all my heart. Then I drank some sweetened tea. At 5 a.m. I fell asleep. It was upon that Sunday morning when I awoke that I seemingly had an answer to my prayer. I became aware of a sense of God's love, intimate and kind, that confirmed my manhood in Christ. I heard a loving voice in my head that said, "Just 2 years now, and she'll be yours." I wasn't sure whether to believe this or not, so I opened my Bible at random to a page of the Old Testament. My eyes rested on the words, "I have said it, I will do it." Staring down at the page, these words seemed to stand out boldly before me. Were they meant to inspire faith in the impossible? Was this to be an intervention in my destiny, a confirmation of my heart's desire, a promise of a future consummation? It was in the confidence of these words that I continued to see Annie. I told her that I believed that God had a common calling for us both in the church, and she let me kiss her hand. For me it was like living in a new realm. I prayed, thought the devil must be hot on my heels, expected God to perform a great work, and wanted to tell the whole world about Jesus. 1 or 2 days later, I waited on God again. I felt something of his awesome holiness, and I had a vision, although vaguely, of the Father God in heaven, his redeemed around him, all joyfully busy in a big party gathering. And I was a little boy, far off, hearing the music of heaven like sleigh bells coming over the wind. And he seemed to say to me, "Now come towards me." Around this time I had heard a speaker at church talk about revival in the church. As he spoke from the platform, he had looked me in the eye and said, "God can use you as an instrument of revival." And, "It is not the battle axe that has the strength, but the one that wields it." And so in this my final year at university, I gave myself over to witnessing for the Saviour, to reaching the lost. Students, lecturers, technicians, waitresses, anyone within or without the university who would listen. I had more or less now given up on my degree course. But my common sanity, insight and natural wisdom had also failed now. The various polar tensions in my life had divided my thoughts and lifted my feet from the ground into a spiritual cloud of fantasy and error. I took example from a Spanish Christian, Michael de Molinos, who, when condemned to death during the Inquisition, had felt called to abandon all understanding and doubt in his quest to walk into the arms of love. And so I only looked for reality in terms of my experience of God. Years later, the apparent dichotomy between truth and reality still seemed unresolved in my experience of the power of God in my life. Christmas 1976 was my darkest time yet. I was cast down. I felt that the Lord was silent. Spiritually, things were very heavy at home. I went down the deepest tunnel I'd yet known. I felt sick upon entering home, and many forces and powers seemed to grind like sandpaper across my mind. I became unable to carry out normal activities. On occasions I'd be out in the car, come home and leave the door wide open. Or I'd lie awake at night, enduring mental torture of an appalling nature, coupled with panic and fear. It was like being driven along cul-de-sacs that closed shut over precipices of turmoil. My mind seemed ripped in many directions. In the new year, back at Aston, I often missed lectures and practical classes because I couldn't face my tutors or friends. I was unable to think logically. Fear came upon me for the future. I'd been labelled schizophrenic by some, yet I felt I should carry on. Study was impossible at this time. I was told that there were rooms to let at Handsworth Wood at the university halls of residence in the summer term. So, mid-January, I applied and booked a room there for the next term. I had a female friend now, a Christian called Natalie. She was on the same course as myself and accepted me as I was, without any questioning or criticism. March marked the beginning of a weekly prayer meeting about the forthcoming mission in the university, and I was now running a Bible study group on Wednesday afternoons. A lot of prayer was offered up, and we expected the Lord to do something great. At Easter I felt better, but was now suffering unwittingly a state of classic psychosis. I sensed, heard, even saw at times mental impressions and thought them real and external to myself. I believed I could inject thoughts into the minds of people around me, in my presence or at a distance, mediated, I believed, by God. Likewise, I believed I could read the thoughts of others, and that my own thoughts were audible to those around me. I was subduing all sexual thoughts now, as I had for many years, pummelling my body as demanded by the Apostle Paul. But now, through the repression of sex, my conscience had become overactive. I found unwanted feelings, looks of lust, and a barrage of sexual accusations that regurgitated and resurged from another quarter of my mind. Such was the split in my mind that at times I actually knew two thoughts at once, and my alter ego, this demonic personality trait, seemed to oppose me in its evilness. My eyes undressed young women before I had even noticed them. Then came the guilt feelings. This great scar across my mind had caused a split, one part my own, the other a lustful persecutor. Later, this demon would be silenced mostly by drugs, except in church and other public assemblies when it still had power over me. Going to church brought untold sufferings. It seemed to be the very seat of my illness. In church I believed my thoughts to be read by others. These spoke with unexpurgated obscenities loudly across my mind and brought accompanying tortures. I would hear the F word shouted loudly across my mind at the quietest part of the service and think the whole congregation could hear it and would identify it with me. Then I would look up from prayer and involuntarily lust after the girl in the next pew. Although I tried to stifle the thought, she would appear through a movement or glance to be aware of and hostile to this, my unwelcome attention. In such manner does the schizophrenic suffer. With desperate self-consciousness flashed frequently across my mind the most sadistic accusations of lust, which I just couldn't censor. These accusations might be largely untrue, but might have a root in some past reverie that the demon legalistically recalls and extends. So I suffered in my early adult years a roller coaster of paranoia that seemed to condemn me before God and man and policed my private yet public hell. It seemed to me, as an impression during these months of delusion, that metaphorical stigmata pierced my hands and feet. It was as if my father wanted to perpetuate these wounds by placing through them well-weathered rusty bars as might be found in the gates and railings of the local park, items that remain intact around the seasons and year after year. Through long-term hospitalisation, which I feared most, I would be silenced and the crucifixion made permanent, and these penetrating metal bars represented this. And such was the oppression that the real bullying and this could not be differentiated. My father was no longer an external adversary. He was inside my head, and he wanted to occupy this space on my shoulders. I was moving away from home into university halls. I seemed to sense the Lord saying, "Foxes have holes and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." Luke's Gospel, chapter 9, verse 58. And many can endure suffering for a short time, but few for a protracted period. A.W. Tozer. I felt I had to move, but doubted the Lord's blessing on my move. Anyway, I did move. Natalie looked after me all term, cooked for me, accompanied me on witnessing trips, and we prayed together each evening. At start of term, I spent a weekend with a Christian friend at Winterbourne, Bristol. We visited a Methodist church on the Saturday night, and I was encouraged by the warmth of the welcome there. Another friend invited me to stay with him at Camberley, and we drove down to Brighton and paddled in the sea. These were days of rest, parental pressure gone, and I devoted myself to the gospel. I wanted a career in the church now, feeling that I was anointed to be a minister. At that time, I came to appreciate that we, the church, have, through the Holy Spirit, all the resources to live and serve God that Jesus had and manifested during his earthly life. The church represents Jesus to the world. Although not reaching his stature, and by no means touching his deity, I felt myself as Jesus in the world. I had been psychologically beaten up at home and by the church I attended. Jesus said, "A disciple is not greater than his teacher, nor a servant above his master. It is enough for the disciple to be like his teacher, and the servant like his master." Matthew's Gospel, chapter 10, verses 24-25. So now, failing my degree course as I knew I would, I applied to the local Bible college in Edgbaston. I was offered a place beginning in October 1977, so I went off to Butlins at Minehead to spend the summer working in the kitchens. I must have witnessed to hundreds there, and spent myself mentally, so upon returning to Birmingham was again overtired. When I started at Bible college, it was as if the glory of the Lord had departed from there. I found a legalistic and cold authority in the place, and none of the love and charisma that had characterised it in the days of my conversion. I shared a room with 3 other students and had no private place in which to worship God. Being resident, my food was provided, but like all the other students, I spent most of the weeks of term hungry. And it was bitterly cold as winter set in, with meagre heating arrangements. But I wanted a career in the church, with, as I thought, Annie to be by my side, so I pressed on, studying, working, witnessing and praying every day. I had a deep love for Wales now, for the people of the mining valleys of Glamorgan, and wanted to take up a ministry there. In those early days I formed a Welsh prayer group in college and considered making a visit to the Rhondda as soon as possible. No opportunity occurred at Christmas time, but the next Easter I was invited to spend a week at the home of another student at Pontyclun, just south of Porth, the gateway to the valleys. I had become quite a powerful street preacher now, and was in my element, sharing the gospel in these townships. On the Thursday of that week of my first visit, I called on Annie's mother. I had wanted to make her acquaintance. I found her to be both kind and pretty in a mature way. Trouble was, as she told me now, Annie got married to Paul before last Christmas. The shock of this news filtered through my mind. I was completely deflated and unable to preach any more that week. And so I sought the Lord wondering if the promise could yet be fulfilled. A fulfilment wasn't due until October the 6th that year. Was Paul to die? I couldn't see how else, bound by the gospel teaching, it could happen. In the meantime, I was devastated. It was to become a blight on my life. The third term at college, I was sick at heart and also mentally failing. In that July, I went on a mission to Torquay with some other students, but came, I thought, under a now familiar spiritual attack. The same accusations of sexual lust that bore in on me seemed to be noticeable to those around me and got in the way of my concentration. But for 3 weeks in August, I preached in Glamorgan, loving those people. I walked the length of the 2 Rhondda valleys, sleeping on the tops of the mountains above the various townships, and staying in the homes of Christians, some of them ministers. I was asked to speak from the pulpit in several chapels, made new contacts, and distributed some 900 gospel tracts. I preached on street corners, and felt fulfilled in this ministry, but I knew I wasn't well. It was at that time I felt myself to be raped by the powers of darkness. An exposure of my nakedness seemed to be broadcast into the minds of women around me and many miles away. Thus would Annie, I thought, receive a full frontal image of me when I was in the shower, and such devastating desecration of my purity and modesty accompanied this exposure. So I felt later, the devil devoured me as a roaring lion and brought about the final blows of my crucifixion when I was too far gone to see or understand the truth. And these exposures went on for weeks. Then I had once come into my mind a momentary image of Annie in her underwear, her limbs and back naked as I had never seen her. And these punishments that so undermined my self-respect and cheapened her, I was told in my thoughts, were divine retribution for past sexual sins, both mine and Annie's. Back in Birmingham in late September, towards the end of the vacation, I turned to the college chaplain, more to justify myself than anything else, to define my experiences and to get his insight into my problems. But he was quick to realise that I was seriously mentally ill and insisted I see a psychiatrist. This was duly arranged with my pastor and chaplain present. Up till now, my parents had not noticed my illness, and it seemed had no idea of what I'd been through. Why had no one picked up on my illness and distress, nor appreciated my myriad problems and cares? But it was a reality. Until this time it had all gone undetected, and I didn't know then that the balance of my mind was damaged and grossly distorted. So it happened, 2 years to the day that I received my promise. Just 2 years now and she'll be yours. I entered a psychiatric hospital without her. It was October the 6th, 1978. I now conceded that I'd lost her forever. I'd finally agreed to be helped, though believed myself sane. My parents drove me to the hospital that evening, and I felt drained. I was interviewed by a young registrar doctor and was told I must stay there provisionally for 4 weeks. I was shown to a bed in a first-floor ward and told to swallow a small quantity of chlorpromazine syrup. The doctor wanted to know what my symptoms were, but my parents could think of nothing except that I kept my light on late at night. I met several other patients that evening, and my parents departed. In the morning I felt very drugged and decided to discharge myself. But as I packed my bag, I was so tired that I just lay down and slept. My suitcase remained all day in the middle of the ward where I'd left it. The doctor interviewed me later, and I tried to justify myself, thinking myself sane. I knew I was scarred, with inappropriate thoughts coming into my mind frequently, and I felt he could help me with this. But my conviction that I could inject thoughts into the minds of others, that I knew what others were thinking, and that others could read my thoughts, he told me, were classic symptoms of schizophrenia. and I heard imaginary voices and thought them from outside myself. My father's fury, pastor's bitterness, echoed in my thoughts and oppressed me. And I had sexual problems and found myself accused of lust, my eyes moving faster than my mind, eyes that undressed young women. The doctor took notes and arranged an interview with a consultant psychiatrist for me. This man asked me various mathematical questions, for example, start with 100 and subtract in sevens for as far as you can. This I did, and he told me that I had not suffered brain damage, but of course I had. I was utterly miserable in that hospital, bereft without Annie, feeling betrayed by family and church, and aware that I had lost all status. The next night, a female patient suddenly dashed to the main exit shouting, "David! David!" An alarm sounded and she was gently restrained. This event triggered such pain for me, as I was just as desperate for Annie. Spiritually, I felt the Lord to be silent in these days, and I found comfort in sleeping in late each morning. I now tried to unchain my troubled thoughts after a final attempt to share the gospel with patients and nurses. This had made me very unpopular. Then I asked the doctor what my options were about discharging myself. He said that if I attempted to leave, he would invoke the Mental Health Act 1958 and section me. Then they changed my medication, putting me on a drug called Stelazine. The doctors were harsh towards me, wanting progress before being friendly. They took a blood sample in order to check if my symptoms were caused by poisons or recreational drugs, but the results were negative. There was a young girl in the next ward called Valerie that I became friendly with, and once or twice we were allowed to go into Birmingham city centre together. Although she was discharged some weeks before I was, we continued to meet up. She had suffered some kind of emotional breakdown, and we were a support to each other, she visiting me often in hospital. In time, I sufficiently recovered to be discharged. I was told that I must go home to my parents. I was warned of a 50% chance of recurring psychosis, and that if it did happen again, I might lose my sanity forever. So I took this warning seriously and tried to unwind the narrow strands of my tormented thoughts. I became aware of intense stress in my mind, which I was told was a normal symptom of recovery. Back at home, I wrote poems, worked the Christmas post as I had for 6 years now, and spent New Year in Valerie's arms. We continued going out until the next March. Then she met a dentist and was soon engaged. My body ached for her. In the next few months, I never saw her again. But my recovery was slow. It took years, and even now I'm not entirely well. My father died in 1985, and I was not reconciled to him even then. He left me with a tortured legacy that had been compounded by the church. He bullied me right to the end of his life, and frequently I stung for days after his attacks. I had not done what he wanted. I still take a dose of an antipsychotic drug each day, and certain memories can still engender a crisis for me when something or someone resurrects past events too agonizing to rationalize. In the early 1980s, most of my siblings and friends were qualifying as doctors, dentists or teachers. None were Christians, and I, who had borne the heat of the day at Aston and beyond, had lost everything, and now had no qualifications, just a broken mind. I had lost my career in the church, my degree, the girl I loved, and my health. I took labouring work through an agency. But life goes on, and on the pollarded tree fresh shoots grow, these somehow not having the strength and health of the original. 25 years on, I'm married to a different angel, a father myself, and a Christian still, but am largely silent and without a positive testimony. I look for and hope towards an audience with my Lord, one day, in another life, to make sense of it all.